is Mark Rye. I'm VP of Sales with Param Corporation, and today we're going to be talking about content rationalization and what are some actionable things that we can do moving forward to get our hands around all of this content that we are creating on a regular basis. If you have any questions on the presentation as we go through, feel free to enter them into the GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar sidebar. There's a questions panel, and I'll pop back from time to time and check on those to see if there's anything there. We're scheduled for 30 minutes, so let's get started. All right, first, just the topic of content rationalization. I really like that terminology because it forces us to think of all of the things that rationalization means and doesn't mean, and to look at our content and how perhaps irrationally we're dealing with it. Most large organizations at the most fundamental level have a content problem around where things are being stored. In terms of sources of content, files being created, there's certainly file shares and shared drives are by far and away, I'd say, the largest contributor or storage location for that type of content still. But SharePoint, tons of content being stored there as well, enterprise content management systems, hard drives, we have files being stored in email as attachments, all sorts of portable media that's carrying content around, and then in the last few years, of course, cloud-based applications as well, so Dropbox, SkyDrive, Box, and all those sorts of things. So you can see certainly lots of options available to users in terms of where they store content, and each one of those repositories has its own problems. So obviously there's lots of files, in many cases millions of files being stored in some of these repositories. There's copies being stored across different repositories, and we're unable to consolidate those or make sense of the copies that are being stored. And then we have this unique taxonomies or unique ways of storing content within all of these repositories. And the individual repositories don't necessarily have a process in place to disposition content. So rational, irrational sounds kind of irrational when we really stop and take a look at what we're doing compared to what we're expecting. And there's a lot of things that we can clean up in terms of how we're approaching this. We're going to start with some of the bigger, higher level questions around content rationalization, and then towards the end of the presentation get into some really specific things that we can do to make changes and move forward. So the big questions, we're going to start off with where are you storing files, how are you managing them, what is the current cost associated, when will they be deleted, why do we actually need to keep them, and who has access. Some interesting questions when we take a look at these in the context of content rationalization. So first up, where are you storing files? And like we noticed on the list, there's lots of options, and that's creating a real problem. Even if we scale those options back to just file shares, maybe a document management or ECM system, a SharePoint site or a series of sites, and email, that's still lots of options in terms of where content can be stored. And at a very fundamental level, we need to look at this content rationalization topic and determine, do we have a content problem? We may. Do we have a user problem? Is it users are storing things all over? Yeah, that's probably part of it. But at the heart of it, is it really an architectural problem? Have we simply provided too many options to where content can be stored? And that's really driving our content issues. So underlying any sort of content rationalization should be a good look at your system level rationalization to see, okay, where are we going with our organization? Where do we want files to be created and stored? How can we limit the options? How can we integrate the options? If it makes sense to have an ECM system and SharePoint, how can we integrate those so that you can search one from another, or there's a actual shared repository and federated search, so that we're not duplicating the actual repository. So that's one, I would say, a good starting point to think about when we're thinking about rationalization, is look at system level issues and configurations. How are you managing files within those repositories? So within each system, how are files being stored and retrieved? So is there some sort of consistent taxonomy that we're using across the different applications? Or is each system completely unique, so that as a user moves from file shares to SharePoint to ECM, looking for a particular piece of content requires the knowledge of three different structures, three different architectures to be able to find that content? Likely that's the case. So most organizations have documented policies around how content should be classified, how it should be categorized, and how it should be retained. The trick is now rolling that out into the actual configurations of your systems, so that we have one set of policies that are driving the configuration of all of these different systems. One thing that I think most organizations don't really consider and never really delve into, from our experience, is what is the real cost? So what is the current cost of this irrational view on content? What's the impact on your storage? So how many different systems are storing content, and what's all of that add up to in terms of actual server space, server costs? The system administration, so if you're managing 5 systems and you could get down to 2, what's the real impact of that? The ability to for a given user to put your hands on a piece of content throughout the course of a normal working day. Again, if we went from 5 or 7 repositories down to 1 or 2, likely, and reduce the amount of content at the same time. Not all about systems. Certainly we want to reduce the amount of content as well. What productivity and savings are to be had there. And then obviously the underlying that drives a lot of this is either the compliance portion of it, or the ability to respond to an information request within a timely manner from outside of the organization. Most cases is where this gets the most attention. How's that impacted by the current environment? And we've put together some worksheets, white papers on this topic, and most organizations that have taken a look at those and said, oh, we've never really fully accounted for the cost. And I think it surprises them when they do, that there is actually money there in the savings that will pay for the content rationalization activity. So it's not something that you need to fund with new dollars. There's lots of money being wasted in this current environment. When will files be deleted? Content rationalization is really about bringing things back to the bare bones, what we really need, and then deleting anything within that structure, deleting anything that we don't need. And go on an ongoing basis, most of the systems we're using have no ability to disposition content. So there may be technically the system may support it, but very, very few organizations have a formal disposition process on any of their systems, let alone all of their systems. So what that leads to is this state of chronic over-retention of content. So something ticks over the amount of time that we need to keep that document or that file. It may be in the best interest of the organization to delete it that very next day, because it may not be something that's in our best interest to hold long term, but we simply don't know where it is, we don't know how to identify it, and we don't have the system configured in a way which will allow us to be able to identify and delete that file at the right time. So this is really what leads to this state beyond the architecture and systems issues that we have. This over-retention of information is what builds and builds. It may be worth looking within your organization and challenging the current thinking around content storage. And quite often we hear from the business especially, maybe IT supports this sometimes as well, but this idea of keep everything. When we don't know what to do, just keep everything, right? And we need to start to really challenge that and build a culture within the organization to say, why do we need to keep this information? Because there's really only a couple of reasons that we should keep a file of any certain type, right? Maybe because that's what the retention policies say, or maybe as a business reference for a short period of time if it's a piece of transitory content. But there's lots of content that just gets stored indefinitely, and we need to, from the records management group on down out through the business, we need to get a culture in place that says, well, keep everything's not the best thing for the organization for reasons A, B, and C. Help people understand A, B, and C and the real impact. And then, again, work on changing that culture. Okay, so if we don't need it, if it doesn't fall into these categories, then we can actually delete this file. South of, in the United States, we say that this has a real impact. The ability or the degree to which you're actually adhering to your own policies around records and information management has a real impact when we get into situations around e-discovery and litigation. If you have simple policies and you're following them, that holds a lot more weight than if you have complex policies and you've never actually implemented them. So being able to build around your RIM program something that's actually actionable so that you can show progress, you can show that you're on target with what you're trying to do, it certainly helps the organization and helps the credibility of that RIM program when being challenged. Who has access to files? This is an interesting one around all of this content that's been created in different repositories. Sometimes I think we don't really think about all of the copies that may exist of a particular file. And it comes into play specifically when we're looking at confidential or restricted files of confidential or restricted security classification, where we locate the, let's call it a final copy, and we move it into a system and put a restricted classification on it. Well, that's great, but the reality is there's probably lots of other copies of that information out there, especially if the file is created somewhere else. There's probably working versions, there's drafts, there's things that have been emailed around. So to be able to feel confident in our ability to actually control access to content that is confidential or restricted means we need to get a much better view of how content is being created through its whole life cycle. What systems are involved, who has access to the content at different points in time, so that when we do apply access control, we can feel confident that things are protected. And without a broader view of that, I think a lot of organizations are not properly securing the content that they mean to properly secure. They may be securing one copy of it or one version of it, but there's likely lots of other versions of that content out there as well. I'm going to just stop for a quick second and hop into the questions to make sure see if there was anything there. I don't see anything at this point. Feel free to enter any questions that you may have into the questions panel, and I'll pop back later on in the presentation. Okay, part 2. Let's take a look at some actual facts here around the environment, the reality that we live in. So unstructured content, the files, the Word, Excel, PowerPoint, the files that we work with on a daily basis, estimated to be growing at between 60 and 80%. What that adds up to is your shared drives, your file shares, SharePoint sites, ECM, everything else are likely doubling now every 11 to 14 months, which should be scary enough in itself. But the reality is the more content we create, the more we need to create. Because without effective cleansing of that content, tagging it so that we can find it, users tend to know that content exists. They take a few minutes out of their day to look for something. If they can't find it, they recreate it. And this is really feeding back on itself and driving this, this growth of content. Now, at the same time, some interesting things are happening. So this growth is accelerating to this point that we're getting to this doubling in somewhere between 11 to 14 months. But at the same time, the ability for storage costs to be reduced are hitting another limit. So we've been running pretty comfortably around every 18 months for storage costs to be cut in half. So in other words, every 18 months you could use the same $100 and buy twice the storage. That's starting to hit a technical limit. I'm sure there will be breakthroughs, there always are, but it's bumping up against some technical limits, right? And for the first time, the growth rate has actually surpassed the rate at which storage costs decrease. So what we've been able to get away with for the past number of decades, is going to be a much different environment in which we're seeing actual storage costs grow and grow compared to the amount of content, based on the amount of content that we're creating. What's it look like for most organizations? We do a lot of content analysis, a lot of content rationalization for organization. Here's an example of content growth within file share of a large company. So you can see for a long time, minimal impact. All of this was happening through the 90s. This was pretty consistent. Through the 90s, things were growing, but not anywhere near the rate we see. And then right around 2000, things started to kick into a different gear, and now we're just growing at an astronomical rate. When we look at the breakdown of most of these, or the makeup of a typical shared drive, you can see what you would expect in terms of the file types, lots of Office documents. So in this case, we're looking at 14.5 million files. About 3.3 million of those are Office documents, another 1.8 PDFs. So the typical culprits are there. Now within those, there's likely lots of versions, copies, duplicates, non-business value documents sitting within those. You'll also see that we're storing lots of odd things in odd places. So backup of web files, multimedia files, databases, executables. Again, this is from a shared drive. So probably you'd be surprised to know that there's 54,000 databases on your shared drive. But it happens all the time. There's lots of things that we don't even realize we're storing anymore. Duplicates, 4.2, almost 4.3 million in this case, close to 30%, which is pretty high, but it's not outside of the range of normalcy at any means. It's something we obviously need to get our hands around. The age of content, you can see a lot of, depending on your organization, this is going to vary dramatically. The type of work you do, how old the organization is, how old your content is. But the important thing to measure against here is your age of content against, obviously, against your retention period. to see what is candidate for destruction. And then there's lots of little files as well that just get created by systems that, 0-byte and Windows temp files and lots of other things like that that can easily be blown away. So this makeup of file shares is not all what you would expect. Out of that 14.5 million, there's only 3.3 million Office documents, which is curious if you begin to think about it. What else is out there? What is all of this? How many of these files exist that are application files from an application that we don't even have anymore? Lots of that going on. So there's lots of content once we get under the covers that and take a look at it that can be deleted with no impact on the organization. So how do we go about it? Let's break down and take a look at the specific steps. So duplicate files, out of date, trivial, and transitory. I want to go through these and the best approaches. So duplicate files, we need to come up with a good definition of what a duplicate is. And for most cases, it has nothing to do with the file name. Okay? So we really want to look at the duplicate by content. So what's in that file? Because if I send out an email and it has an attachment and 10 people save that attachment into the shared drive, they may rename it. They're going to save it different places at different points in time, but it's the content of the file that makes it a duplicate. So we need a system to be able to go in, look at the content of the file, create a simple hash code that says, based on what's in there, this is what the code that identifies that. Then we can compare those hash codes and find out what the true duplicates are. Duplicates are interesting because we need to then set context for the duplicates. Are we trying to deduplicate within a repository, within a subset of a repository, or are we trying to dedupe across repositories? All of those are possible, but there's a couple of gotchas that you need to consider as you do that. Processing for this kind of dedupe analysis, I would put in kind of a medium complexity. There's certainly some technology, certainly some policy or, let's call it policy kind of decisions and work that needs to be done, but it's not terribly complex. Those decisions tend to be based around access controls and who has access to the information, who needs to have access to the information going forward, and what's the records management context of the file. So the takeaway really being deduplication is extremely important to rationalize your content, but the goal doesn't need to be zero duplication. In some cases, the goal just needs to be to remove the duplicate so that you only have duplicates where they're required by access, use, or records context. Move to the next one, outdated content. This one you'll see is a higher complexity for sure. We need to have a good understanding of the retention schedules of the organization. Those need to be approved and ready to go. We need to understand the information about the file, so the ages of the file, create, modified, and last access date. We need to understand the retention trigger and the period, and then we need to classify that content. So we actually need to be able to go through the files, classify them to the right retention bucket, retention schedule, and then automate the processing of, okay, is that file, now that it's here, if it's met its retention trigger, based on the dates of the file, is it eligible for destruction? When we do this right, again, it's complex, but when we do it right, it really strengthens the records management program, right? Because we can say, okay, we have documented disposition reports showing how we're deleting information from our system. And that really helps build the credibility of the organization from a records management point of view. Trivial content is probably the easiest to approach. Trivial is really looking for content that has absolutely no business relevance, right? And there's lots of it out there. Typically, we can do simple things like looking at file size, file extension, and identify file types that simply could not hold anything of business value. and then we can delete those. Nice thing is those tend to fall outside of the concept of most records management programs, so we can kind of go through and do that cleanup and delete without much impact from a records management point of view. And the last one, I know we're coming up to time, I'm trying to get through this, is the trivial cleanup we just addressed, is the transitory cleanup. And transitory is really a somewhat unique definition specific to your organization, but it's identifying the point in time in which a document that has short-term business value tips over and is no longer valuable to the organization, probably because it's either become irrelevant or it's been replaced by a document, a more authoritative source of that information. This one can be certainly more difficult to automate. So the complexity is depends on your definition. And how we can go about it at a very basic level is go kind of business area by business area and looking for folders or areas within the content store where reference documentation is being stored. So things that were of value at one point, no longer of value now. Those are things that we really want to key in on and identify. What does all this add up to in terms of content rationalization? What is possible? Typically, we see redundant or duplicate information coming in, 15 to 20% of content, outdated information, 20 to 30%, trivial, usually 5% or less. And transitory, again, depending on definition and ability to process based on that definition, somewhere between 0 and 20%. So the upside is really a 75% reduction in content. Sounds like a lot, but the reality is your organization probably only needs 20% of the content that you're storing right now to do, to exist and function effectively. So taking that information, a good question to ask would be, what is a 75% reduction in content worth? And again, we can look at hard costs, we can look at soft costs, we can look at liabilities, compliance issues. And again, we have a white paper and worksheets that we can provide that would help you actually document what those savings would be. But I believe most organizations would be surprised to learn how much money could be saved if they actually tackled content rationalization. And of course, Param, we've been doing this for a long time. We've been around for 14 years. We've developed software specifically for this kind of file processing. We deliver professional services as well along with that software to help take an organization from the current state to cleaned up, fewer repositories, deleting 50% or more of the content. So we have experience with all of these things. Many of our clients will take advantage of something that we provide called a content analysis report that will essentially inventory your current state and allow you to do some projections off of that. If you'd like to know more about anything we do, feel free to get in touch with us here at Param, and we'd be glad to continue the discussion. All right, we're pretty much at time, so I'm going to take a quick peek into the question section and just see if there's anything there. If anybody does have questions, feel free to enter them now, and I'll try to address those before we wrap up. All right, I'm not seeing anything pop in at this point, so I'm going to thank everyone for their time. If you'd like to know more information, get in contact. We certainly have that white paper that we can provide with the worksheet if you're interested in analyzing the cost, or we can certainly tell you more about the content rationalization services that we have to offer. Again, thanks for your time and have a great day.